On draft day, when you look who's available to pick, the options for great players seem endless. But once you finally get into the season, the players that boom and the players that bust, they begin to show themselves. Being able to pick the right players isn't easy to do, but I've done the research to make sure that you can do it. I have 4 league-winning wide receivers that you can draft in rounds 4 through 6 of your fantasy football draft. All these players have high floors, and they provide the opportunity of a wide receiver 1 ceiling. Let's take a look. The first player we're going to look at is Keenan Allen from the Los Angeles Chargers. Allen's been a reliable player in fantasy for years now. In the last 4 seasons, he's finished in the top 12 in average fantasy points per game in PPR scoring. He's a much more valuable asset in PPR because he's a magnet when it comes to the football. He's averaged about 9 to 10 targets per game over the last 6 seasons in LA. He's the clear number 1 receiver on the Chargers, and this is a team that's been top 5 in pass attempts every season that Justin Herbert has been the starting quarterback. Last season, Herbert got a rib injury early on, and he received off-season surgery for his shoulder. These are 2 injuries that held him back from his full potential last year. The year before that, he threw for 5,000 yards and 38 touchdowns. Young quarterbacks are supposed to improve with each season, so there's a realistic possibility that Herbert improves on both those stats and he puts up MVP-type numbers this season. Keenan Allen is going to benefit greatly. Let me put it in simple terms that make it sound undeniable that Allen's a great receiver to draft. A target machine who plays on one of the most pass-heavy offenses in the entire league, who is an elite young quarterback throwing the ball to him. Sounds impossible to pass up. But while Keenan Allen is considered the wide receiver 1 on the Chargers, they do have a lot of mouths to feed on that team. I would gladly draft Keenan Allen this season in fantasy, but not as my number 1 receiver. His floor is very high, but his ceiling is at best a low-end wide receiver 1. If you take a receiver in the 1st or 2nd round, Keenan Allen is an amazing wide receiver to draft in the 4th round. The next player we're going to look at is Jeudy from the Denver Broncos. And I have a bit of a hot take here, but in my opinion, Jeudy could be a top 5 fantasy receiver this season. Now, it's a bit insane to think that someone in the lowest scoring offense in the entire league last season has the potential to be a top 5 fantasy receiver, but Jeudy's a player with an insane amount of talent, but he just hasn't been given the opportunity to showcase it yet. Jeudy comes into the season being drafted around the 24th, 25th wide receiver in PPR. His projections are right around where he ended last season, when he ended as the 26th wide receiver, but that was despite missing 2 games and having 1 game where he got 0 fantasy points because he was injured on the very first snap of the game. Say you take away that 0-point game from his stats, he averages about 14 points per game last year. That's more than DK Metcalf, Chris Olave, and Garrett Wilson, and they're all guys being drafted before him this year. 14 fantasy points is far from a top 5 wide receiver, but Jeudy also had to deal with the atrocity that was the 2022 Denver Broncos offense. The Broncos averaged less than 17 points per game last season, hurting the fantasy value for every single player on that team. The Broncos bring in Sean Payton to be the new head coach. It is a massive upgrade for them. Sean Payton literally said that the Broncos coaching last season was one of the worst coaching jobs in NFL history. That's a bit harsh, but is he wrong? The Broncos had so much talent on their roster last year, but they ended up becoming one of the worst teams in the league. When it comes down to it though, the biggest question relating to Jeudy's fantasy status this season doesn't have anything to do with Jeudy himself. It's all about his quarterback, Russell Wilson. Last season was the worst season of Russ's career. If you're going to draft Jeudy, you have to believe that Wilson's able to bounce back and play like he did in Seattle, where he was able to make DK Metcalf a top fantasy receiver. If he can do that, then Jeudy will be a wide receiver 1 in fantasy this year. The third player we're going to look at is Drake London from the Atlanta Falcons. The first receiver taken in the 2022 NFL Draft, London had a good rookie season for himself, ending up as the wide receiver 38 in PPR leagues. He's a very skilled player, but the Falcons' offensive scheme is extremely run-heavy. They had the most rushing attempts in the entire league last year. When they did pass the ball, though, London was the clear number 1 target, leading the team in receiving yards, targets, receptions, and receiving touchdowns. The Falcons played the majority of last season with Marcus Mariota as the starting quarterback. The last 4 games of the season, though, Desmond Ridder took over the starting job. With Ridder as quarterback, London averaged 9 targets per game and 83 yards per game. That's a full season total of 153 targets and 1,411 receiving yards. It's only a small sample size of 4 games, but it's a great sign to see for an emerging receiver in this league. The Falcons added an elite prospect to their team this season, running back Bijan Robinson, so the game plan of running the ball a lot isn't going to change. Even if they'd run more than anyone in the league, They're going to have to pass the ball, and London is the go-to guy in that team when it comes to passing. Almost 30% of passes last season for the Falcons were to London. He had a higher percentage of the Falcons' targets go his way than Justin Jefferson, Stephon Diggs, and CeeDee Lamb had for their teams. He's currently being taken in the 5th, 6th round of drafts, and he's a great option for a wide receiver 2 in your team. I am very confident that London ends up as a top 20 wide receiver in fantasy this season. The 4th and final player we're going to look at is Deontay Johnson from the Pittsburgh Steelers. After a great 2021 season that saw Johnson finish as the wide receiver 8 in PPR, he had a disappointing season, finishing a bit outside of wide receiver 2 status as the 29th highest scoring receiver. The entire Pittsburgh offense disappointed though, going from 20 points per game in 2021 to 18 points per game in 2022. The majority of last season saw the Steelers being led by rookie quarterback Kenny Pickett. He had a bit of a tough time in his first year. Pittsburgh was dead last in passing touchdowns per game, averaging 0.7 passing touchdowns, something that greatly affected Deontay Johnson last season. Johnson finished last season with 0 touchdowns. That's despite being 7th in the league for targets with 147. The second most targets without a receiving touchdown was Saquon Barkley with 76 targets. Deontay Johnson broke the record for most targets without a touchdown in a single season by over 40 targets. It is a statistical anomaly that Deontay Johnson didn't get a single touchdown last year. Johnson is still in the early stages of his career. He turned 27 years old and he's going into his 5th season. It isn't like the lack of touchdowns has to do with him declining because of age. The only thing you can chalk it up to is bad luck. Even with George Pickens emerging as a great player, Johnson's still the top guy on this team. Johnson had double-digit targets in 10 games last season, while Pickens didn't even reach 9 targets once. Johnson is going in the 6th round of redraft leagues. He's someone who would be an awesome flex option or wide receiver 3 for your fantasy team. But if Kenny Pickett is able to play up to his 1st round draft pick potential, then Deontay Johnson could end up having another top 10 fantasy season. Hey, you made it all the way to the end. Didn't think anyone would come this far. Thanks for watching. Remember to subscribe to the channel, give the video a like, and comment your thoughts down below. Thanks.